Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the Sherlock and Pages Book Club show. Today, we are going to be discussing the life of Vincent van Gogh by reference to this book, Lust for Life, the classic fictional retelling of Vincent's life by Irving Stone, a book written in 1934. And we are very fortunate today to have a special guest, the barrister, illustrator, author, man of many talents, Simon Elliott. Simon, welcome to the show.
Hi, absolute pleasure to be here.
And we have one of Simon's books in our window at Sherlock and Pages. And we had it in the window over the weekend, sold a few copies. This is Hockney, A Graphic Life. When did this come out, Simon?
So this was September last year.
September last year. And this is a man of industry. So he has a new book coming out in August, right?
Yep, 8th of August release date.
And this is, rather conveniently, Vincent, A Graphic Biography. So we have someone to discuss Lust for Life with us who has Vincent very much on his mind. Really interested, Simon, what drew you to cover Vincent in your second book? This is your second book, right?
Yep, this is number 2.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I suppose he was just a very natural fit. What I'm trying to do is work through the artists about whom I'm most passionate. So as you said, I started with Hockney and then I moved on to Vincent. They share, I think, just a glorious color palette, this joy and reveling in nature, a fascinating, to my mind, life story. As we'll get into that discussion about Vincent's life, absolutely incredible life. I think it's really interesting, or certainly it is to me, artist biographies. I read a lot of them. It's my favorite genre. And I think it's really fascinating to sort of get below the surface and to figure out what these people were like. You know, they weren't fully formed artistic icons producing masterpieces one after another. These were human beings that led lives. They had successes, failures, loves, all of these things. And I just think it's really incredible to get beneath the surface and discover really the people behind the works.
I think it's everything you said resonates with me because I'm a huge lover of Vincent's work, a fan of him, but the point you started with, the color palettes, and now, as you know, I'm also a really big fan of Hockney, so I felt like we have a natural rapport.
Yeah.
But when you see a Vincent van Gogh painting in person, I was recently very lucky to go to Arles and see Starry Night Over the Rhone, and it's the depth and thickness of the paint and the colors that are so unexpected. I think of that as a dark cobalt blue and yellow painting. When you're actually there in person, it's shimmering in sort of oranges and greens, in particular the greens at the bottom, all different shades of green. And it's just impossible to think that you could paint such a thing. I look at them and gasp and just think, I would never be able to do such a painting. And having taken up oil painting now, it actually just even seems more mesmerizing, not less. So yeah. I completely agree with many of the points that you stated. How did you go about researching a graphic biography? Because as you said, Vincent has had an extraordinary life, quite complex. So how did you go about that process? Because you only having written the other book last year.
Yeah. So I suppose really I go about it in lots of different ways. I watch as much as I can. I listen to as much as I can, and I read as much as I can. So I delve into films. I watched Lust for Life. I read Lust for Life. I read all the biographies that I could get my hands on. I watched a couple of other films, and I just sort of immerse myself in lots of different ways. And then also I seek out podcasts. I always find it interesting gathering together lots of different perspectives, and there's some really good podcasts actually on Vincent. For example, there's one trying to track down a lost portrait of Dr. Gogh, and it's a really fascinating, almost true crime whodunit situation. And I just get really excited. I get really sort of into the story just by delving into it in lots of different ways.
Did you see Simon Sharma's the Power of Art episode on Vincent, because I actually think that is one of the points that really drew me into his story. I think a lot of people only kind of know the rudiments, the sunflowers, the incident with the ear,
Yeah.
the controversy around the end of his life, and often people don't know much more. I was probably in that category 10 years ago, but that Simon Sharma episode made me understand, the power of Vincent van Gogh.
It's a remarkable thing, isn't it? I think he's a great communicator. I think he's a terrific writer. I think he's just got a really enviable talent of making stuff compelling and really accessible.
Yeah.
And that's what I think makes a great documentary or book.
And apologies if you can hear any banging outside. We're in Sherlock and Pages now, as always, and there's someone loading outside, but it shouldn't make too much difference. People probably can't hear it, but just in case. So you gathered all together these materials, and does your book cover Vincent's life from the very beginning, from his birth all the way through to the events at Auvers-sur-Oise at the end of his life?
Yes, that's exactly right. So begin at the beginning and then actually goes on slightly past the end, if you like.
Okay.
Because the way I really got into this story, I read a terrific New York Times article, and it was all about Jo van Gogh Bonger, and perhaps we'll come to her later on. But I got very interested, very excited about her story and her role in shaping Vincent's legacy. So having read that article, got really excited about it. I thought, do you know what? I want to tell Vincent's story, but anybody that reads the book will discover Jo's our narrator, and she takes us through Vincent's life. And one, I wanted an outside perspective, so I thought it'd be good to have a first-person narration, but someone who wasn't Vincent. I wanted a bit of objectivity in the narrator. And also, I wanted someone that could take the story into the bit that, I mean, his life story is phenomenal and interesting in so many different ways, I think. But then the aftermath of it is incredible. How do you go from an artist who sold one painting during his lifetime, had no real great success, certainly commercial, obviously produced works of staggering genius, but how do you go from that, sold one work, basically unknown, to international superstar, art phenomenon, works in all the major galleries, his work being, amongst the most valuable in the world? I was really intrigued by that question. Well, how did it happen?
We'll absolutely get to that, because that is something that I don't know so much about. I know that Jo had a huge role in securing Vincent's legacy and that of her husband, Theo. But it's not something I know a huge amount about. But I know it happened incredibly quickly, because it was only last week we were lucky enough to go to the National Gallery, because this year is the 200th anniversary of the National Gallery, which I'm sure you know, Simon, but for those who are viewing this, in London. And there will be a huge Van Gogh exhibition starting in September. So because we chose Lust for Life as the Sherlock and Pages book club pick, and we'd done videos on Van Gogh, we actually were lucky enough to be invited to a launch event for the 200th anniversary. And I found myself alone in some of the Impressionist and post-Impressionist rooms, standing before the sunflowers that they own, which we'll get into, but Vincent obviously painted for Paul Gauguin when he was traveling down to Arles. And what I understood is that the National Gallery already I think in the early 1930s realized that they needed a knockout, absolute Van Gogh masterpiece. And they paid, at that time, it was the most expensive painting in the world. And that's in the early 1930s. Van Gogh died 1890, I believe. Yes. So within 40 years, he's gone from relative obscurity, some notice, to being the world's most famous artist. So yeah, we'll definitely get onto that. Before we really dive into Vincent's life, where do you stand on the pronunciation of Vincent van Gogh? Because online I get a lot of stick for this. I feel like if I attempt to say it in the Dutch way, it may seem pretentious.
Yeah.
If you're English, there's kind of a codified Goth if you're English, Go if you're North American. In my mind, it's Vincent or Vincent van Gogh. Almost, if you're Dutch, and I can't do it. So where do you stand on this?
I'm absolutely with you, Luke. I have to say, my concern about having written Vincent's story is I'm going to have to pronounce a lot of French words about which I have no clue. And his name, of course, yeah, it's a tricky one. But yeah, I'm with you. I'm Van Gogh.
Well, I get a lot of stick for this, and even not respecting Vincent's legacy because of my pronunciation. But this is mainly has come from North America, actually. And
Well,
they settle on Go, which I think is fine because that's kind of in the North American culture. That's where they've settled on. What does it matter?
I mean, one might argue to really go to follow his intentions, we ought to call him Vincent, because he refused to sign his works Van Gogh. He didn't like his family at various points of his life, and he certainly didn't like the baggage that came from being a Van Gogh. So he said, no, my work should be signed Vincent, because he wanted to connect with people. You know, all throughout his life, he was saying, my dream is that the working man should be able to hang prints of my work in their workplace or home. You know, he just wanted to be really accessible, really informal. So I'm sure if he were here now, he'd be saying, call me Vincent.
Well, that you make a very compelling argument, and also I suspect an element of your legal training has come through, because that's also very convenient. But I'm willing to go with it. I think we should call him Vincent for the rest of the episode. So the book, Lust for Life, this starts in London, I believe, when Vincent is in his early 20s, and he's working for Google's, an art house, an art cellar, which his family is intimately involved in. They're some of the most famous art traders, art dealers across Europe, relatively well-to-do. Some of the family extremely wealthy. But Vincent's father didn't enter into the art trade. Could you give us a little bit on just a very kind of quick history of from Vincent being born to how he finds himself in London, the kind of the context of the family and where he grew up?
Yeah, I mean, you make a really interesting point, Luke. So his dad was a preacher, and I think quite an unremarkable one. But his grandfather had been a notable art dealer. He had 3 uncles who were all very successful art dealers, particularly Uncle Cent, who owned Goupil. I mean, he was sort of internationally renowned. So a very, very prominent family in cultural circles. He also had an uncle who was head of the Navy, living in Amsterdam. So he was an admiral. So a really very, very successful family. And I suppose really Vincent could have been an early Nepo baby in a way, Nepo baby, because he came from this great pedigree, particularly in art trading circles. And for a while, it looked like that was going to be his trajectory. So I don't think he made any great waves at school, didn't love lots of the schools that he attended. But anyway, fell into the family business, was encouraged to go into that by his uncle Cent, who didn't have any kids. So he was, I suppose, looking for someone who he might train up and ultimately pass the business on to. And that's how Vincent then got involved with the business. And he was trained in different offices and eventually moved to London. And also Theo sort of entered the business about the time when Vincent was moving to London. So it was a family affair.
So the book, Lust for Life, starts, and I was really interested, having learned quite a lot about Vincent's life before reading Lust for Life. People kept on asking me, have I read it? And I hadn't, but I'm so glad we picked it for the book club. But it starts in London when Vincent has either self-nominated or been sent out to the branch. Yep. And he actually lived, and I did know this already, he lived not far from where I did for a little bit, in South London, between Brixton and Clapham Junction kind of area. And that's where the book begins. And I was hooked straight into the book because it talks about him falling in love with Ursula, the daughter of his landlady. And it's from there that I think we get an insight into the intensity of Vincent. And as far as I'm aware, these are real events that did happen for the most part, with some notable exceptions within the book. Is that the case for Ursula and that time in London.
Oh, absolutely. So this book, for anybody that hasn't read it yet or doesn't know the background, is drawn largely from Vincent's letters. So Vincent and Theo, throughout their lives together, prolific letter writers. They couldn't pick up a phone, they couldn't text at that time. So they used to write to each other, and they did so really prolifically. It has to be said, Theo was really assiduous in saving his letters, Vincent not so much. So the conversation is slightly one-sided. But these wonderful letters exist between the brothers, and they provided really the launching pad for this book.
And just as a bit of a plug for Sherlock and Pages, we do have the letters of Vincent van Gogh in the shop and also online. And also in the shop, we now have this edited edition by Thames and Hudson, Vincent van Gogh, A Life in Letters as well. I haven't dived into this one as yet, but I have read many of the letters, and I mean, I think we should comment on what an extraordinary writer Vincent is in his own right, and the intensity of his artwork is certainly reflected in those letters.
Oh, absolutely. Lots of the letters, I think, read like true poetry. They're really beautiful when he's describing the colors that he's using, the inspiration that he's drawing from a scene or the season. All of these things are drawn out, and they're so beautifully portrayed. There was just such an intensity and a closeness between Vincent and Theo. And I just think the warmth of it and actually the intellectual rigor. I think sometimes Vincent is really tragically reduced to a mad figure, you know, someone with mental illness, and sort of painting because of that. And I think actually the reality is he's someone that had mental health issues, but he painted despite that. And actually when he was ill, he wasn't really creating. And as soon as he was feeling better, that's when his real creativity and the productivity kicked in.
Well, we'll get to his period in Saint-Remy de Provence, which is probably known, kind of raises the issue of Vincent's mental health issues because he's in an asylum, so it's kind of self obvious. But I did some videos on Vincent's time in the asylum at Saint-Remy de Provence, and I think I was acutely aware of what you've just articulated as well, because it was when he was feeling better that he was at his most productive. He was even asked himself about, or wrote himself about how he wishes he could do more if he was better, and that he will get better. And he repeats this a lot of times. And some people accused me of romanticizing the mental health issues of Vincent, which I felt was really unfair on my portrayal of him in those videos, because it's certainly not how I feel. It's an unavoidable fact that he did have moments of intense mental health instability, but that's not why I did those videos. It's just to cover the reality of his life, and I think that's really important. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Coming back to London, so he has this quite youthful, I would say, infatuation. He decides that he's in love with Ursula very quickly, and he goes from being a really competent, if not top, art dealer at Gogh, seen as someone who might go on to inherit the family business, it seems, or certainly parts of it, to kind of being really sloppy very quickly. And how does he find himself from being this kind of quite privileged individual who's doing very well in the art business, to being in the Borinage of Belgium and in the minefields? How does that happen within the space of a couple of years?
I mean, yeah, it's a fascinating change, isn't it? So I suppose when he first moved to London, he was in a very good position, earning far more than the average working man at that time. So he was financially stable. He found himself in lodgings and, as you say, fell in love, became absolutely infatuated. I mean, it's a real theme of this book, isn't it? That we've got sort of overwhelming intensity of feeling, verging on mania throughout his life. He clearly fell desperately in love. And actually, I mean, it's one of the tragedies underlying his life, that he's always sort of falling in love in unsuitable situations or with unsuitable women for whatever reason. And the love is unrequited. But he felt clearly this burning passion and a desire to be in a committed relationship and to have someone to whom he could be really devoted. So actually that intensity of feeling is, I think, a big motivator for that change. So he was in London in this good situation, but this unrequited love became utterly intolerable. He fell in love with his landlady's daughter, who was actually already secretly engaged to a former lodger. So she was unavailable. Whether or not she'd have been interested in Vincent, we know not. But in any event, she couldn't really return his feelings. And so the situation became really, I think, dark, uncomfortable, probably quite intense,
awkward.
Yeah. And ultimately he had to move out, and he did that. And then, so going forwards from there, depression followed, more sort of difficulties with his mental health, not necessarily always acute, but certainly sometimes manic depressive episodes. And he really fell out of love with his work. So an area for which he had initially had great enthusiasm, selling people these beautiful prints that he recognized and appreciated, he fell out of love with it. He thought it was all rather grubby and commercial. He had, as I mentioned, this difficult relationship with his family, couldn't quite reconcile himself to how phenomenally successful they were, both in monetary terms, but also in sort of cultural life. And yeah, I think at this time, a lot of those issues came to the fore, and that really led to him making dramatic changes.
So his family almost have two sides to them, professionally, in terms of being art dealers, but they've also got close to links to the church, and particularly his father. So he decides that he wants to go down that path and enters into it with what I think could be the motif of Vincent's life. I think you put it, an overarching intensity of feeling sums up Vincent so well. I think he even wrote later on in one of his letters that I want the world to know that I'm a man who felt things deeply, and well, he certainly achieved that. So he ends up in a very, very poor mining community in Belgium. Can you just comment on how that happens very quickly?
Well, so he wanted to be an evangelist, and he trained for that purpose, and he was hoping to get a posting as a missionary, but I think he was overzealous. We'll return to that a lot, but his feelings were too deep about it all. There were theological difficulties with those who were teaching him, and in any event, he couldn't make it work. He clearly wasn't a conformist figure, wanted to do things his own way, and so ultimately he wasn't given the missionary posting that he hoped for. So he decided, again, in this sort of overzealous way, well, I'm going to go to one of the most deprived, difficult situations in Europe. He went to the Borinage. I mean, wages were subsistence level. It was extremely physically backbreaking work. People were in the mines pretty much all day, every day. They were eking out the most meager of existences, being paid very, very poorly. And actually, I think it's done so well in the book. I really like this Borinage, these passages. I thought it really evoked that life, the sort of lifestyle at that time very, very well.
I was just going to state it now that, as far as I'm concerned, the chapter on the Borinage in the book is the absolute strongest part of it, and makes it worth reading in and of itself. It is utterly compelling, and we can't go into all the details of that long chapter, but Vincent's commitment to the cause and the commitment to these people almost is the end of him, right? He ends up living in the same conditions of these people. There is a scene in the chapter where he actually goes down into one of the mines, which sounds terrifying. Do you know if that actually happened, or if that was an artistic license, or is that something you're not sure of?
I can't speak to whether he actually did go into the mines, but he certainly, it's right from the letters, was living their life. So he was living in the same kind of accommodation, these shacks, very meager, very poorly adapted to the conditions, which were sometimes brutally cold. They were mining for coal, but ironically, coal was in short supply. They were only able to really try and burn the scraps that they were finding on the slag heaps and stuff. So it was a very, very difficult life, and we keep coming back to it, but this sort of zealousness from Vincent verging on mania. So I'm not just going to go and try and help these people. I'm not just going to go and try and preach to them, but I'm going to absolutely envelop myself in their lives. He gave up almost all the food that he had, his clothes, any possessions that he could give up in order to try and help them.
'Cause he was given a small wage eventually after a sort of trial period by an evangelical organization, was my understanding. And even that was kind of on a trial basis because they were very unsure of Vincent, overwhelmed and overcome by his intensity and kind of unique nature. But even that small wage, he just gave away pretty much immediately and ended up in very poor conditions. And some of the hardships these people went through are incredibly difficult to read about, I think, and put yourself in that position. And this isn't all that long ago, or all that far away. So I think this is the best piece of writing in the book, and I really recommend that people dive into the book for that chapter. But I feel like it's got so much more to offer as well. But ultimately, Vincent becomes sort of searching for the right word. He sees himself as a failure, but also thinks of his time in the evangelical mission as a failure as well, because he cannot improve a lot of these people. In fact, after a series of incidents, it almost seems like they're worse off when he decides to leave than when he started. But this is also happens to be the time when he starts to draw and to get maybe this sign that he's an artist. How do you think that happened in terms of Vincent becoming an artist in the most unlikely of circumstances?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think a lot of it was about being in close quarters. He had so much affection for his parishioners until he was basically fired, I think, by the church authorities. They were his parishioners, had so much affection for them, was living at close quarters. And he clearly had this impulse to sketch and draw and had been doing that for parts of his life. His mother, I think, was an amateur artist. And so throughout his life, he'd been flirting with the idea of it, I think. And I just suspect, living in such close quarters to these people for whom he had so much affection, I think it just really created an impulse to try and depict in some way their lives and the surroundings that were around them. I know, for example, when he was in London, not to take us back to London, but he was very taken with the sort of artistic movement that was about depicting people's everyday lives. He liked a strong narrative. He liked, people being shown as they were, living the lives that they were leading. And so I wonder if there was a slight connection there.
But he starts off, or at least my understanding is that he starts off really drawing, and it is drawing with almost no materials, and he's scratching about to try and even get little pieces of paper and pencils and things, and he's kind of doing nothing. And so what is Vincent's next step after the evangelical period ends? Or where does he go next, and how does he go from there to taking up life as an artist? And I guess this is where Theo enters the scene, and I think it actually says that at the start of one of the chapters in the book, Enter Theo.
Well, so it seems clear that about that time Vincent decided that art was his calling. So in 1880, for example, he went on a sort of art pilgrimage, and he traveled for days in biting winter conditions, insufficient provisions. But anyway, he was pursuing an artist that he liked, wanted to sort of see where he was living. He was then sort of drawing and making work more and more, again, as you say, on sort of a modest scale in relatively meager terms. But absolutely fair to say that love of depiction, I think, had already taken hold. We've got a journey to The Hague, so trying to take up art and study with his cousin with a bit more seriousness there. We've also got some time at home, and actually with Cian in The Hague and then Margot at home, we've got unrequited love, unsuccessful love. and him, I suppose, trying to sort of turn those passions maybe towards his artistic pursuits.
And it's worth saying that during this period, so Vincent eventually ends up in Paris alongside many of the famous impressionists and those who are seeking to take on impressionism. And I think that this is covered in great detail in the book. But already by that period, he's kind of ostracized himself to a degree from the old academic world of painting through his behavior, his excess, and we can't keep saying it enough. But I think it's worth covering his relationship with Christine in the novel, who is Cien in real life. I'm not sure why that change was made by the author, but it's probably so that English readers could understand it. Could you just comment on that relationship? Because there is a quite striking drawing that I remember seeing of Cien by Vincent. Very touching, but it seems like that love of the maybe the poor and the downtrodden and the reality of the real human was something that he kind of saw in Cien.
I think that's right. Leading into, I suppose, this love of narrative painting, so things that were depicting real people in their real lives. He also had this, I think, slight obsession with the fallen woman and his notion that he could somehow be a savior, a comfort or a help to people in difficult circumstances. So Cien, for example, worked as a prostitute, amongst other things. But I think it's quite striking, isn't it, for a minister's son who was raised in relatively traditional circumstances, a very well-to-do family. It's quite striking that he sought out people in difficult circumstances. He wasn't evidently stuffy or concerned about that sort of thing. He just pursued his passions, and for a time they had a great love, I think. He was living in a tiny garret, a little studio, and she eventually moved in with a daughter from a previous relationship. And there was clearly a lot of intensity of feeling there. I think initially kept secret from his parents and his family, no doubt mindful of the fact that it would be a tremendous scandal, and ultimately the relationship was revealed.
And this is all going on in The Hague, right, where Vincent is seeking to learn from professional artists and really take up the trade, but obviously he has to take his own route. And I think it's worth saying at this point, when at the start of the episode I say I'm a fan and a lover of Vincent van Gogh and his artwork, I think you can stretch into some sort of, or you could fall into idolizing. And I don't think I idolize Vincent. I see him as a full person with many flaws and many great strengths. And I think there's a great deal of kindness, but there is also, I mean, Vincent would have been a nightmare to know. And I have a lot of sympathy for Theo and other members of his family, which I think we can get into. But I just think it's worth stating that, because I think when you and this must be something that you deal with covering these artists, you can almost be seen as like a fan, but it's kind of your job to give the full picture, right?
Absolutely. And it comes back to where we started, that he's not just a fully formed art icon from the word go. He's a confused teenager, a slightly lackluster student who didn't really like school. He's a bit of a drifter. He's at one stage a religious zealot. He's just someone trying to find his way in life. And it's really testament to these letters, the basis of the book, that we know all of these things. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these insights. And I think that's a big part of why he has become such an iconic figure, because actually we've got a lot more sense of him as a man than we have with other artists, even artists a bit closer in time. We don't necessarily have all of their thoughts and impulses recorded in their own words.
And so moving on the story, so after trying to train as an academic, artist, painter with some big names, he's kind of left, going back home again to his parents' house, where his dad is the minister in an area called Noonan, if I'm correct. And he is kind of starting again there. And I think it feels like an interim period where he doesn't really know what to do next, but he's still very much keen to work on his art and is really experimenting in oils. And it's there that he meets Margot, who is one of, is it 4 or 5 daughters in the village? 4 or 5 daughters. And it's a love affair where none of the families are really that keen on it. It ends very badly. I think Vincent kind of has a double check on himself and whether he really is in love with Margot, although it does mean a great deal to him to be loved. It doesn't end very well. And he then is encouraged by Theo to go to Paris. Is that correct? Is it Theo, you think, who moved him into the center of the art world at that time?
Well, so where, as far as Vincent's family were concerned, his star was on the wane, Theo's star was on the rise. So by 1885, Theo was already manager at Goupil's Paris branch. So he was very much at the forefront of the art scene in Paris at that time. And I think really just having tried to study and tried to pursue his art, Vincent decided Paris is where it's at. It's clearly at the artistic forefront. The Impressionists are sexy and exciting, and I think Vincent wanted a bit of that action. So he effectively just arrived on the train, sent a note to Theo saying, "I'll be at the Louvre at midday. I'll see you there." And really just moved himself into Theo's flat and very much into Theo's life.
So one of the people in the book club who read Lust for Life said that she was just astonished by how Vincent had this capacity to just change just so quickly. It is almost it's like hard to describe how that is the case, but it just happens throughout his life. He's a man of intense feeling, emotion, and very reactionary to circumstances, it seems. And
yes, absolutely.
And that is, as far as an explanation I have, this is the man that we're dealing with. So he gets to Paris. He's late 20s at this stage, right? He takes up being a professional artist very late in the day, relatively. And there is, I think this is, if the Borinage is my favorite part of the book, the Paris section is my second favorite, because his eyes are opened to a whole new world of art, the Impressionists, light, color that he's not really been aware of. And he actually, there's a scene in the book where he almost gets angry, saying, well, why have I been away in the Low Countries, scrawling around, painting in what he describes as gravy colors? And he meets the likes of Toulouse-Lautrec, of Gauguin, of Cézanne, Seurat, many others. This must have been such an exciting moment for him. Can you reflect on your reading of this chapter and maybe some of the other things you've learned about that period for Vincent in Paris?
Well, I think it was just such a revelation, wasn't it? This new art, new colours, new styles. It must just have been the most astonishing period of time. I mean, actually, for a character like Vincent, who was clearly prone to a lot of self-reflection and not necessarily looking upon himself or his achievements with much generosity, it must have been quite hard, I suppose, to be exposed to, as you say, thinking, well, why on earth have I been using these dull colours and fixating on this particular kind of art when this was what the exciting artists in Paris are doing? So I suppose it must have been a hugely exciting, motivating time, but also a time of real challenge, because he suddenly thought, well, actually, the art world's way ahead of me, and I now need to really catch up. And I think that's slightly reflected in, I suppose there were personal reasons as well, but I think Theo really tried to delay Vincent from coming to Paris because he was concerned that Vincent's art would look quite old-fashioned, that he had this sort of rural fixation, he was using dark, mucky colours, and Theo's concern, I think, was that it just wouldn't stack up against the artists of Paris.
But it's worth mentioning that Vincent wasn't, with the benefit of hindsight, hopeless at this point, right? He'd already produced what is considered today, and this is with the benefit of hindsight, kind of his first knockout masterpiece, right? The Potato Eaters. Do you mention this painting in your book, and do you think it's a particularly important one, or is that just something that I've picked out?
No, I absolutely agree. It's hugely important. I mean, it's 1885, I think, the Potato Eaters, widely regarded as his first masterpiece. It's a beautiful scene, actually, very, very tender. It's the de Groot family. And he paid them a modest sum, and they posed for him, and he created this really intimate scene. It's awash with light, even though it's dark. You know, you've got the light gleaming off their faces as they're really gathered around. I think it's sometimes described as a rural Last Supper. It's that idea of coming together for an incredibly significant, special meal, even though the ingredients are very modest and their living was similarly meagre.
I've never heard that phrase, a rural Last Supper, to describe the Potato Eaters, but I think that is such an apt description, and it's the summation, isn't it, of that period of his life, of living in the Borinage with the people, with working people, with the struggle, their connection to the land. You can almost feel the soil on the hands of the de Groot family, his connection with or his ability to connect with people, no matter what class or circumstances they have. So I just wanted to raise that. I realized we hadn't mentioned it when we get into Paris, but then all of a sudden that those quite muted colors he described as gravy colors, that's out, and he starts experimenting, right?
Yeah.
Unsurprisingly, with excessive zeal and intensity. And it seems to me that one of the viewers, well, I'm sure he is viewing this, but one of the people who read the book said that Vincent was copying and encouraged to copy other artists. Did this help or hinder his creative genius? Now, I feel like it certainly helped for a period, but as we will see, it was really when he was left on his own that he sort of really comes into the genius element of things, because he does get a little bit all over the place in Paris, and he's experimenting with all sorts of techniques like pointillism and such things. Yeah, I wonder if you could just comment on the reputation of his art during this period, because he was very prolific, right? And he was there for about 3 years, right?
Hugely prolific and clearly very influenced by the artists of Paris. I mean, he was studying there, so he was copying works as art students have done since the beginning of time. He was clearly very influenced by some of the prominent artists of Paris at the time. I mean, there's one of his beautiful self-portraits, clearly very influenced by Seurat, who was, with his pointillistic technique was coming to the fore. I mean, I think it's quite evident in the background.
We'll have to get that one. I know exactly the painting you're referring to, so we'll have to get that one on the screen now. Maybe we can be in a little box. But yeah, okay.
And so I think he was just awash with all of these ideas. I mean, we keep coming back to his enthusiasm. I think he was just voracious in trying to take on board everything that was going on, but also distill it very much through his own prism. So I don't think you could ever say that any of his works are truly derivative of, other notable artists in Paris at the time. For me, he was always pursuing his own unique way of doing things.
Yeah, and this is a great time of experimentation, right? When the Impressionists are seeking to really capture light and bring new techniques to the fore. And Vincent eventually understands that he needs to go his own way, right? And he becomes a little bit sick of Paris. He's surrounded by artists who are always commenting on his work and the way that he should go. And I feel like he felt a little bit psychologically overwhelmed, a little bit flustered by all of this noise and all of these egos and personalities around him. And he actually does a complete 180 U-turn, because for a moment, there's an idea that there's going to be a commune of artists, and that Theo will be their lead seller. And from wanting to surround himself with fellow artists in a very confined commune, he then decides he needs to break out and go on his own way, all the way to Arles, and I think inspired slightly by Cézanne and his move to Aix-in-Provence, but he goes to Arles on the coast. Could you, comment on, well, one, whether you think that's true, and two, a little bit about Arles and what Arles is like?
I mean, one of the things I find so interesting about Vincent is he's always this man of contradictions. So, for example, I mean, lots of people fixate on he only sold one painting during his lifetime. And they take from that he was an unsuccessful artist. But actually, in his time in Paris, he was organizing some exhibitions on a modest scale. They were in local restaurants, but that's the way these figures who are now internationally renowned artists, that's what they were doing. That's how they were showing their work and trying to sell it. So he also got some critical comment at that time. He had write-ups that were quite complimentary. And although on the face of it, he seemed to be pursuing that and trying to establish himself as an artist, in great contradiction, he also said success is about the worst thing that can happen. And he wrote to that, the critic had given him this favorable article and said, don't ever write about me again. So he didn't... In some ways, he seemed to want to be a successful artist, but in other ways, he was sabotaging himself, it seems, at every turn. So I suppose partly that feeds into what you've been saying, Luke, about, he was a bit overwhelmed by the noise and the intensity of Paris. And so he wanted a different style of living. So, as you say, he wanted to set up an artist commune, wanted to really focus on the art and not the noise. Also, I think poor Theo... We've talked about Vincent not being an easy figure to live with. I mean, Theo had a nervous breakdown at this time because I think it was probably just quite overwhelming trying to live with and manage Vincent. Theo became quite an ostracized figure, I think, in his social circle, because every time anybody came round for dinner or whatever, there was a big argument with Vincent. And so... there was a lot of noise, a lot of things going on in Paris that he perhaps needed to get away from and have a break from.
One comment I would have about Lust for Life, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, is that I don't think Theo gets the full character development that he should do and that he necessarily deserves. So that would be a point of criticism that I would have, not too harshly, because I think it's a tremendous book, but someone who read the book as part of the book club commented that at times Theo almost seemed to encourage and maybe even indulge Vincent's kind of self-destructive streak. But from reading some of the letters and some of the documentaries that I've seen, I feel like Theo did all he could to kind of... You couldn't control Vincent, but he tried to surround him with love and support. And even, Theo, in my mind, is a bit of a saint, but everyone has their limit, right? And he wasn't perfect, and he had his own life and his own cares and concerns, and so I think he did just about all that anyone could be expected to do, and in the end, he's to be praised for that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that point, and also his appearance in the novel.
Well, I totally agree, actually. I think Theo is slightly underplayed. And I mean, for me, of course, the emphasis is on Vincent. It's his work. He was the genius. However, people don't achieve things in isolation. And Vincent's a really good example of that. For me, they're a trio, actually. You've got Vincent, you've got Theo, on whom he was totally reliant, certainly for most of his life, financially, emotionally. He was, an invaluable figure in Vincent's life. And then we've also got Jo, who gets even shorter shrift in the book.
Hardly at all.
We'll come to her when we get to the legacy stage of our discussion. But to my mind, they're three people absolutely essential in properly understanding his life and his story.
Yeah. And just before we move on to Arles, is there a painting from this period of time in Paris that you maybe would like to highlight to the viewers that we could show that is particularly... maybe a sign of Vincent's achievements in this period of time?
Well, actually, there are some beautiful views that he drew from his room in Paris, which I think show just how much he developed as an artist. So we see, first of all, bringing in some of the styles of Paris at the time, but also, if you look at it, the progress that he's made in terms of the quality of the drawing, so the perspective, the strength and confidence of the lines. There are so many things, I think, to admire in the latter works of his time in Paris.
And it's after Paris that he moves to Arles on his own to become a painter of the South. And for me, it's from this period, though, that he the absolute blockbuster, world-renowned, international masterpieces come, and they come thick and fast. And I feel like in the novel Lust for Life, the author, Irving Stone, may have either been running out of time, or he might have put too much into the Paris section and the Borinage. That, for me, it does seem slightly strange that the greatest period of artistic achievement for me in Vincent's life is covered in I think 3 relatively short chapters.
Yep.
But I think for the viewers, we should kind of cover quickly some of the famous incidents from Vincent's life at this time to complete the chronology, and also some of the famous paintings. So he's in Arles, very hot, very ancient city, next to the Camargue, a kind of marshland area, flatlands in the south of Provence. And he moves out of the hotel he's staying in because he finds the famous Yellow House, which in itself is a very famous painting. And then he's hanging around this night cafe. Could you just give a description of the kind of world that Vincent is living in, and how he comes to be connected even more closely with someone he met in Paris, Paul Gauguin?
So, you're exactly right. It was just an explosion of creativity. It's like he'd found his perfect muse. We've got so many masterpieces that come at that time. I mean, he's living the life, I suspect, staying at these in these inns, visiting night cafes, lots of absinthe, lots of booze, lots of smoking, lots of coffee, very much immersing himself in the local scene. So we've got the Night Cafe, for example, one of his most famous paintings from around that time. We've also got his brilliant portraits of Joseph Rouland and his family. So I think for the first time, Vincent was really finding some close connections, proper friendships that were warm within a healthy family environment, which, perhaps because of his own difficulties, but Vincent never really found that with his own family.
So we should mention Joseph Rouland. There's these iconic portraits of him, and he's a postman, right?
Yeah, big bushy beard, phenomenal uniform. Yeah. It really captured Vincent's imagination.
And I think this is one of the great reasons to read Lust for Life, because you see these characters in galleries or in photo books of Vincent's works, and you read that it's a postman, but it doesn't really connect until you have that full narrative. And I think that Lust for Life is so valuable for that, because it's very hard to read, a sort of academic biography of Vincent and get the same feel for it, which I have done, and there's some really brilliant ones. But this really brings it to life through the fictional narrative.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I really do encourage people to read the book or go back to the letters, because they're just so evocative of the time, the place, how all of these works came about. I mean, it's a really invaluable insight for my money.
And Paul Gauguin, how does Paul Gauguin arrive in Arles?
Oh, so Vincent moved to Arles, and he had great ambitions, I think, of establishing a sort of artist commune. So he wanted people to come and live in the Yellow House and work there with him. And he became particularly keen on the idea that Gauguin would come. Gauguin was, I can't remember where he was painting at the time. He was broke.
I think it was Brittany.
Yeah, I
think he was in
right.
Brittany, yeah. And he was sick as well. He wasn't very well.
Yeah,
right?
He wasn't very well. He was absolutely broke. And Theo, I think, really, again, just trying to help Vincent in a phenomenal way, encouraged Gauguin to come and stay with Vincent in Arles and hope that they would successfully work together. So he offered him a little stipend in exchange for a monthly painting. He said, go and stay in Arles and work with Vincent.
And there's this strange piece of the book, and I'm trying to give the audience a true impression of how I feel about the novel. I think it's brilliant, but I think there's flaws in it. And there's a strange part where a character called Maya appears, who is entirely made up, who's meant to have followed Vincent for 8 years. And in my view, that should have just been cut out by the editor and left. And actually, someone who'd read the book as well in the book club asked about this character, and I don't have much more to say. It just seemed very strange to me. I don't know what you thought about Maya.
Well, what did you make of her? Was she a muse? I was almost thinking Greek mythology, or was she some sort of delusion? I mean,
that's the only forgiving thought that I had on it. I wondered if it could be some sort of slightly mishandled appeal to Vincent's kind of mental instability, that this character is actually like a hallucination as such. But it is so strange. I didn't I didn't buy it. Put it that way.
It's curious, isn't it? The author's note at the end where he talks about it being the obviously fictional passage. And I just thought, well, I'm interested in his motivation for including it.
I think okay, that's very the forgiving take. It's not so bad, and it wasn't really to the detriment of the novel overall for me, and it's a very short incident. But actually, following that piece of writing, I think there's a great piece of writing where Gogh arrives, and he's kind of, I think, and the Simon Sharma documentary on Vincent also shows this, he kind of arrives to an absolute fury of activity and production from Vincent. And I think Gogh is a bit of an arrogant artist, and he thinks he's kind of one of the top artists in the game, and he arrives to this madman Vincent, who has always maybe been looked down on a little bit, but I think they thought he had something, just producing these masterpieces at just like a painting or two a day. And famously, he painted some of the sunflowers for Gauguin's arrival in the Yellow House. And we talk about Vincent's unhappy life, but there must have been moments of pure ecstasy when he was painting like this, and it must have been hard for Gauguin to deal with.
I think that's probably right. I suppose what was intended as this warm welcome, I've produced these stunning paintings, and I've hung them in your bedroom to bring you this real pleasure. I guess maybe to Gauguin was a bit of a declaration of war, actually, as an insecure, as lots of artists are, you know, maybe a slightly insecure figure. And he's like, oh my goodness, I expected to come and be the master, and actually you're producing this stunning work, and I'm perhaps quite intimidated by it. I mean, there's no denying Vincent was, you know, continuing his pattern of instability at this time. Too much coffee, too much alcohol, too much smoking, depending on whether he wanted to raise or dull his senses. And yeah, I think it was just an overwhelming environment for Gauguin to find himself in.
And a battle of the wills, I think, a good way to describe it. And I think I remember that Gauguin does a quite almost cheeky portrait of Vincent, kind of showing him just intensely at an easel, and is almost sort of mocking him in it. So quickly the atmosphere turns very sour, and the dreams of Arles fade, and there's the famous incident with the ear. Now, I think a lot of Vincent's life has been kind of immortalized and documented so well, but often the truth of it gets a little bit lost. So what would you say is the truth of the famous Vincent ear incident? And I will just say this, because in the book it says he chopped off his ear. As far as I'm concerned, he just sort of had a nibble at the lobe. What's the truth of it as far as you're concerned, Simon?
Well, actually, it might be another image we could show on screen. There's a sketch from a doctor that treated him after the incident, and it shows with a dotted line, somewhat grimly, where the portion of his ear that the doctor recalled him having cut off.
Okay.
And it was actually, I think, most of the ear, leaving just some of the lobe on.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So it was documented. And why did he do this?
I think just it was almost the release of a flood, wasn't it? It was, you know, they'd had this incredibly tense, well, they'd had an initial period of happiness and productivity. I think it lasted about 2 months, where they actually got on reasonably well. Albeit Gauguin, I think, found Vincent a difficult character because he was messy and sort of financially disorganized. It was a chaotic life. So they'd had that initially happy period. Then it all went wrong, probably through too much drinking. They hit the winter, so they couldn't go out and paint. They were sort of stuck together. They didn't have any money, so they couldn't go and do a lot. And I think the tension just got far, far too much for them. There were nights of too much drinking of absinthe, and the culmination of one of those nights was a potential violence being directed towards Gauguin. But ultimately, Vincent went home, sliced off his own ear, and then delivered it to a lady that worked at a local brothel. So it was, you know, it's very sort of desperately sad, very disturbing behaviour.
And I think as big and as wild as Vincent's dreams must have been, the puncturing of those dreams must have been absolutely crushing for him. And unsurprisingly, he dealt with them sometimes in the ways that have been time immemorial, you know, excessive use of intoxication and lack of health, and the exhaustion of all of his work seems to have accumulated. Some people who read the book as part of the book club asked about what his mental instability was, and as far as I'm concerned, it seems like there's been quite a lot of academic study of this, and it's quite hard to piece together exactly how this might be diagnosed today. And indeed, I mean, I think mental health in general is very hard to diagnose, you know, in neat boxes. I don't know if you have any comments or feelings on that, having studied this in detail.
I mean, I think ultimately when he went to the asylum, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, or what they described as schizophrenia at the time, and complicated by syphilitic symptoms, or you know, complications from that. So and probably you know, if one reads about his life, it comes across so overwhelmingly in the letters. He never slept, drank too much, smoked too much, you know, poor diet, poor lifestyle, just not really taking care of himself. So almost certainly exacerbated all of those other issues.
Yeah, but this is I mean, Arles is a period where it's just, if that's all he'd done, he would sit in the great pantheon of artists. So we've got Starry Night over the Rhone, and also the Sunflowers. And I was lucky enough to see the Sunflowers up close in person recently, and it was just almost shining off the wall, absolutely beautiful. And I can't imagine how Gogh must have felt being faced with that. I mean, it's an absolute all-time knockout piece. So, and then there's the Night Cafe, paintings of the exterior and interior. So this is just such a phenomenal period of time. But there ends up being a petition against Vincent. He's become such a well-known kind of infamous character in the neighborhood that he's asked to leave by the local residents. And I'm not sure if this is covered so well in Lust for Life, but there's a discussion between some doctors and Theo, and it seems for a while that he's going to be sent to an asylum in Arles, which would have been a disaster, because I read that the conditions there were just awful. But he actually ends up, fortunately, being able to afford to voluntarily commit to an asylum he's heard about in relatively nearby Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, which is a beautiful place, a place I'm very fortunate to have visited several times because I have family there. Beneath the Alpes mountains, the light there is just extraordinary, sort of mauve, purplish colors in the evening. And he has a real up and down time in Saint-Rémy de Provence. Could you maybe comment on some of the paintings that he produced here and his experience in the world of that asylum? Because I think it's quite hard for people to understand what an asylum might have been like at that time.
Well, I think actually it was a sort of fascinating place he found himself in. A big place on a castle-like scale, but I think there were only something like 12 residents there, so the place was mostly empty. He had his own room, and he was allowed to set up a studio in a vacant room. So actually, I think, as one would hope, it did him a lot of good being there, because he was forced perhaps to lead a slightly cleaner life. He couldn't go out and drink too much and do the other things that were not doing him any good. And so he was really able to focus on his work. Now, there were, of course, bouts of depression and mental illness within that time, but also the stunning productivity and the beautiful work very much continued when it could. And he was depicting the building itself, the mountains, the trees, self-portraits, of course, and famously, perhaps most famously, the Starry Night, the view from his window. So he was I say in my book, actually, throughout his artistic life, he was trying to perform this kind of alchemy. He was transforming his pain into these just overwhelmingly beautiful things.
Mm,
And I just find it so touching,
mm.
his whole time in the hospital.
And it's worth commenting on Starry Night, probably the most famous painting by Vincent, perhaps one of the most famous paintings in all of art history. And it is really a work of the imagination. I mean, having been to San Remi, that view doesn't really exist. It sort of does, but the church in it, the famous church spire, isn't actually really there. And it's a sort of swirling, dancing, cosmic firmament that is just so excessive and beyond. And really, I think that painting kind of sums up how far Vincent had gone into feeling versus even impression, or certainly the academic painters. Where do you think Vincent sits in the evolution of art history? Do you think that he really sort of moved things on, and that is why he's so famous, or is that part of why he's so famous?
So I suppose just on Starry Night, while we're mentioning it, what I find really interesting is he sent that work to Theo, and Theo was quite scared by it because, as far as he was concerned, it was his brother slipping away. So Theo wrote back and said, "Don't do work like this. You're much stronger when you're depicting real things."
Did he send a sketch of it?
Yeah, so he sent a sketch and then ultimately the painting as well.
Wow. So Theo, do you think that was Theo's artistic voice or his brotherly voice of care?
Oh, I think it's absolutely his brotherly voice of care. Because when we get to the legacy stage, you know, the works of Vincent that were not embraced nearly so much and took a lot longer to get recognition were actually the works from his time in the hospital. So I think people saw them, bringing, I suspect, a lot of their own prejudice to it, but people saw in them the sort of product of a disordered mind.
And it does, I don't think we should underplay how ill he was during that time at the asylum. I mean, I even remember reading about him gorging on his paints at times, a total like, kind of blackout periods. But he stays there about a year, right? And there are some hopes for him that he's kind of recovering his faculties, right? And he is going to go back to Paris, and I think he does for a short period of time, stays with Theo, who has met Jo, his wife by this stage, right? And he gets to meet his nephew, who's been named after him, Vincent, which is a very touching moment in the novel. But then he goes to Auvers-sur-Oise. Can you describe what Auvers-sur-Oise represents in the artistic world and roughly its location?
Well, so it's not too far from Paris. So I think the idea was Vincent could go somewhere quieter. He could have a bit more repose because he was finding Paris quite overwhelming for lots of different reasons. So the idea was that he would go away, stay somewhere not too far away so he could have visitors or perhaps visit when he was well enough, and really sort of dedicate himself again to his art and again sort of lead a cleaner existence. So Theo and another friend organized for him to be supervised by Dr. Gachet, and who seems like a sort of fascinating figure in his own right, real eccentric, I think, very into homeopathy. Vincent very quickly reached the view that Gachet, he said, is sicker than I am, because Dr. Gachet also suffered from depression. So, you know, it was a strange marriage in a way, but it's right that they formed a very close bond quite quickly. And Dr. Gachet loved art, and he loved Vincent's paintings, so they had an immediate point of connection.
Yeah, so they were able to understand each other. They probably had some elements of their temperament in common, or at least they were able to understand each other's vulnerability. Have you ever had the privilege of going to Auvers?
I have not. I'd really like to go.
You must go. There are few sites that I visited in my life, historic sites, that have a resonance and have left me with such emotion as Auvers. And it's in a very understated way, because you arrive at the station, which in itself is one of the revolutionary acts in art history, because the painters were then able to get out into the countryside and take their tubes, another revolutionary act, the tubes of paint, which wouldn't have existed a few decades before, but then did. And you walk up the hill past the cafe restaurant where Vincent would have stayed, and you go to the church which he painted, the church at Auvers, which is famously kind of almost wobbling in the painting, and is a real reflection, I think, of Vincent's personality. But it's from there that you get out into the fields very quickly, and it would have been those fields that he dragged his easel and equipment out onto and painted, you know, wheat field with crows, and the cemetery is right next to it, and it's all in such a short space actually, and you can't help but see and almost feel him walking through those fields, and it's exactly as you'd imagine. And when I went, I was so lucky because the sky was pregnant with storm and rain, and it was like wheat field with crows, and you can still see the path of the fields that he painted. And there's just something so moving and resonant about that location, that he's still there. He sort of haunts that ground. However, there are great controversies about how Vincent ended his days, and this seems to go on and on. So I think that we should make the viewers well aware that the account in the novel of Vincent's potential suicide are contested, and actually there are accounts that Vincent was a very placid and actually quite affable chap to some people in Auvers, and was doing good work. He did have run-ins with local teenagers, and he was always seen as a bit of a strange character in the town, but that's nothing new for Vincent. So I'll put it to you, Simon. What do you think we can say about the death of Vincent van Gogh?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of speculation about it, isn't there? And I know there are whole books dedicated to it having been a murder. I mean, I don't think that's the academic consensus, and certainly everything I've read suggests that tragically he's a figure that just decided to end his life. He started writing a letter to Theo, didn't finish it, popped that in his pocket. Ultimately did then, I think, send off another letter requesting paints and other things. So again, you know, Vincent's contradictions. It's strange for a man to be ordering paint to then decide to end his life so soon after. But it's right, I think, that he left his hostel, or the inn where he was staying. He took with him his usual paint supplies and took with him a small revolver, and ultimately shot himself in the abdomen. One can only imagine the pain of that situation, both emotional and physical, of course. And he managed somehow to get himself back to where he was staying, managed to get himself upstairs. I think you're exactly right. He'd made a good impression on lots of people. Certainly where he was staying, you know, they went to check on him because he hadn't appeared for supper. And that was not, he was usually a man of routine, getting up early, keeping regular meal times and going to bed early so that he could be up early to paint the next day. They went to check on him, and it became tragically clear that he'd shot himself. And in fact, that's what he told them he'd done.
I mean, of course, it's incredibly sad. It seems trite to even comment on that in such a way. But I'm interested about the view that you often hear, if only Vincent knew, if only he knew his reputation now and could see what he's become. But I don't get the sense from what I've read and seen about Vincent's life that he considered himself a complete failure. And I think that somewhere there was a flicker inside that understood that he was doing something special. And that's not just a sort of maybe delusional or, you know, very narcissistic view. I think that he was getting feedback, and there is, in Lust for Life, there is probably an excerpt from a real journalist piece who said this is the kind of the coming guy in art, right? And some of the praise that he was getting, he was clearly a little bit tickled by it, but also found it quite hard to deal with. So I think we should comment on that really quickly.
Yeah, it comes back to this man of contradictions. So getting good write-ups, wanting to do good work that would be recognized, but then very much rejecting it and shying away from that praise or success when it did come. I mean, his big sale and his sort of success in exhibitions largely came when he left Paris, because Theo was suddenly able to promote him without Vincent getting in the way.
Yeah, well, I can imagine that being so true. And however, so Vincent died. Is he 37 years old? Tragically passes away. And I get the sense that, you know, for all of the criticism and all of the fun making of Vincent, quite a few people from the artistic world descend on Auvert. There is a really poignant funeral, and he's buried in the churchyard right next to the field where he painted Wheatfield with Crows, one of his final paintings, which is extraordinary. I mean, it is literally a few hundred yards. You have to go, Simon. You really have to. And not long after, Theo tragically passes away through ill health, possibly some of the emotional impact of the loss of his brother, who was so dear to him. And they are buried together at the action of Jo. And I wonder if you could talk about that legacy and what she did for Vincent, for Theo, and the paintings.
So, I mean, although I've been interested in Vincent as long as I can remember, it was particularly reading about Jo's story that got me interested in writing about his life, because she is, in many ways, the key to it being known and the legacy that ensued. So, as you say, Vincent tragically died. Within about 6 months, almost to the day, Theo then dies. Jo inherits the paintings, hundreds of them. She inherits the drawings, hundreds of them. And she inherits the letters that have been exchanged between the brothers for most of their adult lives. She's a young woman. She's not trained in the art world. She's not familiar with the world of business. But she very much took it upon herself. I think she considered it a real duty, a responsibility on her part to create a legacy for Vincent and to create a legacy for Theo. And we haven't talked too much about Theo, but in addition to being very successful at Goupil's, he also harbored this desire to become an independent art dealer. And key to that was he wanted to be able to promote Vincent and that new style of art which he really loved, but he was not having great success sort of selling on a commercial basis. So there, I think, in creating and recognizing Vincent's legacy, Jo also saw that as an opportunity for Theo to get the recognition that he richly deserved for having recognized and appreciated this new mode of art, really from the word go. So as a young woman, I think such a heroic figure, such an interesting figure, and she's not talked about, not known about nearly enough. So having inherited all of these things, I mean, really, she started doing her research. So she started identifying key galleries that she thought should know about and be interested in Vincent's work. She was already an accomplished linguist. So in addition to sort of creating interest locally in Amsterdam, she was also writing to Berlin, and she was writing to people in Paris, and she was able to try and get sort of recognition on a wider scale. Really, after the Theo's death, Jo inheriting everything, Bernard was in Paris, and she said, look, do you think Vincent we could do a solo exhibition for Vincent? And he said, no, I don't think Vincent's got enough of a following. See,
who's Bernard? Sorry.
So forgive me, a sort of fellow artist. And so he said, no, Vincent, I think, doesn't have enough of a following to justify a solo exhibition. But he said, look, leave the paintings in Paris and I'll try and find some buyers. It won't be quick, but if you're going to find buyers anywhere, it's going to be in Paris.
And was Jo in financial trouble at this moment? Was there a real imperative for her to do this financially?
Well, I think she was left in modest circumstances. So although Theo had earned quite a lot of money through Goupil, it's right that he'd been supporting artists, you know, not least of which his brother. And I think he'd probably overstretched himself. And a lot of his difficulties, in addition to sort of mental health, were anguish about his financial circumstances and about how whether his investments or hopes would pay off in that respect. So yeah, a woman in modest circumstances, so she decided to relocate and set up a guest house. I mean, imagine being a guest in that house when it was first set up, a house entirely filled with Vincent's canvases.
The things that must have existed, the times and spaces, yeah, unbelievable.
It must have been absolutely overwhelming as a sight. I mean, I'd love to see that guest book. But yeah, so she declined that, which I think is, again, you know, real testament to her long-term vision, testament to her bravery. She's got no experience of the art world, no experience in business, but she said, I'm not going to let you sell them. I think this collection needs to stay together because that's how I'm going to build a legacy over time. She started trying to persuade critics. So Jan Veth was one of them. And initially he, along with various other critics, kind of rubbished Vincent's work. They were described as childlike and that he was painting with a desire just to be different, almost contrary.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think he was a great color mixer sometimes, color straight from the tube, and that wasn't considered sort of properly done, that he wasn't harmonizing the colors, he was sort of contrasting them. And I think now we would say, well, that's one of his greatest strengths, that he, you know, it's the contrast of colors, not trying to make everything work together necessarily in harmony,
which would have been the way.
Blending, bland.
Blending, bland.
So by 1892 she'd also already achieved, you know, quite a big solo exhibition for Vincent. So this woman still in her early 30s, she's only 33 by this time. But she was going to the galleries. You mentioned her son, Vincent, you know, he'd be in one hand and she'd have a canvas under her other arm. And she was going to these galleries and trying to persuade them that the work was worthy of notice. By 1895, so only 3 years later, she persuaded a Parisian dealer, Vollard, to show 20 of Vincent's canvases altogether. So the reputation is growing by turns each and every year, a bit more recognition, a bit more persuasion, and it's all due to her dedication to the cause. She was also selling works. She was, I think, just instinctively very savvy. She was selling some works because she knew that was a way in which to create interest in the art world, in the market, but she was retaining the major works. And then by 1905, the major exhibition in Amsterdam, 484 works all shown together.
484.
Yeah.
Wow. So the only time that will ever have happened.
Exactly. The only time it will ever happen.
I'd be happy to see 3. No, really. I mean, 484. That's unbelievable. That must be one of the best exhibitions of all time.
Exactly. And, you know, to think that she was renting the space, she was organising the posters, she even bought a bow tie for the staff, but just one because they had to share.
I mean, we talk about genius in all forms of life, but for me, Vincent van Gogh represents 2 things, which is an instinctive genius. And I think that was present in his early sketches. And when you read Lust for Life, which retells his life story, you get a sense of this, that he had something early on. Even if he was mocked and criticized throughout his career, some people believed in him. But then he worked and he worked and he worked and he worked furiously. And I think you kind of often there's this idea that there's 2 types of geniuses. There's the instinctive one and there's the one that worked themselves into being one. And I think Vincent is kind of a synergy of those 2 geniuses. And at that exhibition where there was how many works?
484.
484 works, 1905 in Amsterdam. You must have been able to just see how he worked himself from quite crude, dull pieces into absolutely dazzling masterpiece. Unbelievable.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just another fascinating aspect to his story. But as I mentioned earlier, the works that were not necessarily embraced at that time and not necessarily included in the exhibition were the asylum works when he was in the hospital.
Right.
They took a lot longer to get the recognition that they deserved.
They're some of the most famous now. amongst the irises, Starry Night, the olive groves. This is where the cypresses appear. So those at first weren't appreciated as much.
Exactly. And although I said Jo kept on hold of the major works, in fact, she sold Starry Night. I think perhaps because of Theo's initial skepticism about it. And also it wasn't getting a lot of critical recognition, which is unbelievable to us now. But it was really, I think, skeptically viewed by the critics at that time. So she sold it, but ultimately a year went by and she thought now is the time to start showing this. So she bought it back.
Oh, she bought it back because now it's in New York, isn't it? I don't know, but I mean, we could trace the history of all these paintings and it would be a fascinating book in itself. So then the reputation is already kind of, the snowball is going.
Exactly. And Jo made it as part of her life's work. I mean, of course, she had another husband and she had her own life in her own right. But in terms of Vincent's story and her connection to it, she really made it her life's work to get the work seen. One of her celebrated causes was also the letters. She felt, and I think in quite a modern way, she felt that people understanding Vincent's story would help them to understand the work.
Yeah, of course.
So she wanted a translation, English translation of the letters, because particularly when she went to America, we're talking sort of 1916. Jo was then in her 50s.
Okay.
And she went to America because, having slightly cracked Europe in terms of Vincent's legacy, she wanted him to get some recognition in America. And she felt really, really strongly that the key to that was an English translation of the letters being published so that she could really show people not only the work, but the reasoning, the motivation and the inspiration behind them.
And there has been a fantastic book written about Jo and her legacy. In fact, you came into the shop just when we'd opened and asked me, you said, well, you won't have it, but we did have it. We don't sadly have it in the shop anymore because it's a huge, big, heavy book and we didn't sell many of them. But I'll make sure it's on our website available for people who are really interested. We also have the letters. There's a few other books that we have about Vincent. We have the complete works of Vincent van Gogh as well, which I'll put up, which we do sell quite a lot of in the shop. And I think is a great accompaniment to Lust for Life, the fictional retelling of Vincent's life. And yeah, there are so many documentaries. And as you mentioned, Simon, podcasts. And ultimately, the best thing that anyone could do if they really want to have an accompaniment to Lust for Life, of course, is to read Vincent, the graphic biography by Simon Elliott when it comes out in August. And then maybe if they're lucky enough to be in the UK or visiting the big Vincent Poets and Lovers exhibition coming up at the National Gallery, maybe we can have a visit together, Simon.
Oh, that'd be wonderful.
That would be great. We could have a shop visit and kind of update people on our socials. That would be really great. Yeah, thank you so much, Simon. I have enjoyed that conversation immensely, and I feel like we could go on and on. Is there anything else that you really want to comment on before we wrap up?
Well, I suppose just this. Vincent's dream really was for working people, ordinary people, to be able to hang prints of his work in their homes and workplaces. And what a fantasy that must have been, someone that only sold one painting in his artistic career. And yet now it's the reality. Millions of people appreciate his work all over the world. It's due to Vincent's incredible talent, world-changing talent, Theo's support throughout his artistic life, and Jo's determination and her absolute legacy building, you know, on an unbelievable scale. And the three of them together, that's why we all now love and appreciate his work so much.
Yeah, and people are sending in postcards of Vincent's works that we're hanging on the ladder above our till, our counter just here. You probably can't see on camera, but please do keep sending those in because it is making the shop incredibly beautiful and adding character every week. So I love it when I get a Vincent van Gogh postcard through the door. Simon, thank you so much. We must have you on again sometime, and it'd be interesting to see what you're up to in the future. And I would just mention that, well, maybe we should have a discussion on Hockney at some point.
Oh, yes,
We've got
please.
Hockney, A Graphic Life here. And I have one of the works, an original poster of it above our sofa at home. And we have a Hockney above our bed at home, actually. So we have a real affection for Hockney and his works. I think one of the great 20th century, 21st century artists. So yeah, maybe we need to cover that in the future.
Yes, please.
All right. So well,
Thanks so
see you
much.
again, Simon.
Thank you.